Shalom and welcome to the Middle East Report. And in this program today, we will be unpacking the crisis that we've seen over the summer in Afghanistan, and particularly with the Taliban taking control of the country. We'll be discussing what are the consequences for the Middle East and the West. Warm welcome to the programme, and today's guest is all the way from Wiltshire. His name is Rhett Parkinson, retired Major from the British Army and also the Director of the Armed Forces Christian Union. So Rhett, absolute pleasure to have you on the programme today.
Simon, thank you. Always a pleasure.
Likewise. And of course, you've been on quite a few programmes with me before, and I really appreciate the work of your ministry that you do and the vital role I think Christians play in our armed services today, and how you give them that spiritual support and comfort is so vital, particularly in the days in which we're living in. Do you want to just unpack for us a little bit for our viewers who are unaware of the superb work you do through the Armed Forces Christian Union, your role and how you're able to help Christians serving in our armed forces today?
Thank you, Simon. Well, we are a charity that traces our roots back to 1851. In fact, to the area of the Afghan-Pakistan, modern Afghan-Pakistan border, when an officer in the British Indian Army wrote home to his church and said, "Please pray for me to be a faithful witness, and for my soldiers who don't know Jesus as Lord and Saviour and don't have a Christian faith. And by the way, the locals are trying to kill us. They're quite hostile to us." And you could say, you know, some 170 years later, very little's changed. We have still, up until last month, had people on the ground in that area of the world. And those of us who are Christians very much want to be faithful in our Christian faith, and the way that we practice that as soldiers, sailors and airmen, and churches around the country and Christians around the world are members of the AFCU and support us in prayer primarily, but also financially. We run 20 to 30 events a year in a normal year. Last couple of years not really been so normal, and they are designed very much to help people in their Christian faith, but we're also developing other initiatives like veteran-friendly churches to help those with PTSD, and other things to help youngsters, and particularly our focus is on serving men and women. We very much work in support of chaplains as well, regular reservist and cadet force, and other military Christian organisations. But yeah, I stand currently as the lead director in a long tradition of Christians who have a heart and a passion to see the name of Jesus raised up in the armed forces, particularly the United Kingdom, but internationally as well. And we have a rich history going back many decades of supporting other military Christian fellowships. That's a little snapshot of who we are. I guess if you want more, look at the website. Absolutely,
absolutely. And you get my endorsement completely.
Thank you, Simon.
I love the work that you do as well. So important, particularly our young men and women who are believers that need so much prayer support, so much protection, because they're putting on their lives on the line for us, particularly now as the world is destabilizing. The threat of an escalating conflict, even a kind of global war, could be on the horizon as the world situation is so precarious. But I mean, Rhett, you served in Afghanistan. You've had your time out there, so when it comes to Afghanistan, you know what you're talking about. But I think before we discuss your military engagement with the country, I think we also need to start really where this recent conflict began. And it really began in '79, didn't it, with the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, and from there we saw the emergence of the Mujahideen, who were Muslims right across the Middle East, flocking to Afghanistan to fight against the Soviets in Afghanistan and to push them out of the country during the Cold War.
Yeah, I mean, I had a quick look at the history of Afghanistan. It goes back thousands of years. It has a very rich heritage and history. In fact, even Alexander the Great made a visit. But all the way through, they've been part of different empires, had small empires within the country itself, had a king for many years from really the early 1900s, late 1800s, early 1900s. After various British Anglo-Afghan wars, which didn't go well then for us either. But it really culminated, or recent history, I guess, is there were various assassinations through the 60s and 70s, and they deposed the king. They brought in, the communists came to power after playing with trying democracy, various factions, both sort of right-wing and left-wing, came to power. The communists ultimately came to power and were struggling, and made an arrangement with the Russians that should things go south, they would invite the Russians in. And in late 79, I think it was, that's exactly what they did, and the Russians ended up putting over 100,000 of their troops into Afghanistan. One thing about Afghanistan is they often are, there's a lot of tribes. I don't think I would not pretend to be an expert on Afghanistan by any stretch of the imagination. Yes, I've served there, and I have an inkling of a little bit of what's gone on. And I've taken a particular interest for obvious reasons in the last couple of decades. But I think it's a hugely complex society and made up of ideologies, Islam being one of the key sort of overarching ideologies. The Pashtun tribe is one of the biggest tribes. They have something called Pashtunwali, which is very much a kind of way of life, the way of the Pashtuns, where if you come in, even as a foreign occupying army into someone's house, they will be hospitable. They are obliged to give hospitality, whether it's ISAF forces or whether it's the Taliban with an RPG over his shoulder. They will be very hospitable. As soon as you step out the house, of course, you're then vulnerable to being a target again. And then in the north, you've got all the various Stans and Tajiks and other tribal sort of groupings. Dari is the language in the north. But you've got all of that playing together, different layers, different blood feuds, different families. So it's hugely complex that as Westerners, I don't think we really got to grips with, and I don't think we really understand. And that's just the internal bit, and maybe later on we'll go on to the external powers and factions that have been at play for, well, arguably centuries if you go back as far as, Alexander the Greek and so on. But certainly the great game in the 1800s and through the 1900s and into the 21st century.
Absolutely, because it's also Afghanistan acted as a kind of buffer zone to try and protect British India from the Russians. And of course, that's where the conflicts of the major powers end up being close to wanting to take Afghanistan for its strategic value. But it's also called, isn't it, the graveyard of empires, that empires that have gone into Afghanistan have come off very, very badly, as we saw that with the Russians when they left Afghanistan in '89. What do you think it was about the Mujahideen? I know that they were then funded by the CIA and American forces in the war against the Soviet Union to actually force them out of Afghanistan.
Well, the Russians were very heavy-handed. The figures, anywhere between 500,000 and 2 million Afghans were killed in those 10 years that the Russians were there. They were just wiping out whole villages. And I think that's made the Russians obviously very unpopular. And therefore, the one thing that the Afghans are very good at is combining when they have a common enemy. And they very much did that against the Russians. But once the Russians had left, of course, there was a vacuum of power, and there was a lot of infighting, and arguably that created the conditions for the Taliban to come to power, which is really what happened in the 90s. in sort of by 95, 96, the Taliban were strong in the south, always have been. It's largely a Pashtun-based grouping, and they managed to take Kabul, and then were fighting against General Dostrum and General Massoud, who combined to form the Northern Alliance. And that's the state it was when, in late 2001, when Western eyes turned after 9/11 very rapidly, and identified as Afghanistan having provided, the Taliban having provided a safe haven for al-Qaeda.
And al-Qaeda and its leader, bin Laden, kind of formed their Islamic terrorist organization after the Gulf War of 1991. The fact that American and British and other Western nations had decided to be based in Saudi Arabia, near the two holy sites in Saudi Arabia to Islam, Mecca and Medina. And it was the fact that American and Westerners were on the soil of Saudi Arabia is what triggered, is believed, bin Laden to set up al-Qaeda and to carry out attacks against the US. And of course then we saw throughout the 90s then increasing number of al-Qaeda attacks in which President Clinton decided that he wouldn't respond to those attacks. I think in 1997 we saw the attack in Kenya and Tanzania on the US Embassy, which caused absolute devastation through suicide bombings, and then the attack on USS Cole in, I think, 2000. And so the terrorist attacks were escalating against the states, and Clinton did nothing, even having the opportunity to use a Tomahawk cruise missile to actually target bin Laden and his terror team, and decided to stop that operation. In hindsight, that proves that would have been the right thing to have done, wouldn't it?
I think, I mean, hindsight's a wonderful thing, isn't it? Interestingly, USS Cole the previous week, I can't remember the frigate, but it was an HMS, it was one of Her Majesty's ships that was in that berth. And after the USS Cole, we discovered that that attack had been intended against a Western, Navy ship. But they'd run out of fuel on the rigid inflatable boat that didn't make it as far as the British frigate. So I can't remember, it was 2021, 22, 23, something like that. US sailors tragically lost their lives on the Cole, but that could very easily have been a British. And who knows what the British response would have been. I mean, we had the cruise missiles as well. And it's very difficult. I think we can be the armchair critics and look back. We don't know what was going on in the White House. We don't know what Clinton's advice was, what the intelligence was, what the feed was. On hindsight, it looks like it was a foolish mistake to ignore al-Qaeda, particularly those two attacks in East Africa, where I think in each of them they killed over 200 people, mainly local people, not so many Americans. But had we paid attention then, and perhaps we could have taken preemptive action to avoid 9/11, and who knows what the 21st century would have the new millennium would have looked like had 9/11 not happened.
Absolutely, and I think we also have to take into account that for example, after the collapse of the Berlin Wall in 89 and then 91, we saw the collapse of the Soviet Union then, and we saw the emergence of the Russian Federation. This was effectively the Cold War over, the Americans winning. I think it was the Clinton administration that decided to de-invest in human intelligence. So they didn't have intelligence operatives on the ground. They thought they were then the world superpower, unchallenged in the world. At the same time, the British government was pretty much dealing with terror from the IRA and weren't really looking into the attacks of Islamists and this growing Islamist threat. And until kind of 9/11 came, when not only the United States woke up, but the whole Western world woke up to the threat of Islamic terrorism carried out by al-Qaeda, and they used Afghanistan as a base in which to launch attacks. Is that when the world woke up to the real dangers posed by this Islamic extremism, terrorism that the West has been fighting now for over 20 years?
Yeah, I think it was a game changer. I mean, particularly for the Americans. We in Britain have had a recent history of terrorist attacks on mainland UK. You think of, Birmingham pub bombings, the Hyde Park bombing, and various other attacks, close quarter assassinations and other things. So Irish extremism, terrorism, was part of our recent history. And I think we have a different sort of history, a different psyche, a different mentality, a different culture really to the Americans. I mean, they're close cousins, but there are lots of differences. For the Americans, and I know at the time a lot of analogies went back to Pearl Harbor and so on. I mean, Pearl Harbor was an island in the middle of the, not in the middle, but well out into the Pacific. But that psychologically was a real psychological blow to the Americans. 9/11 was absolutely devastating, and I don't think we fully understand it as outside of America itself. This was the first large-scale, externally sponsored attack on the United States, on the mainland of the United States. Now, I had friends serving in the Pentagon at the time, and they said they utterly went to pieces. They were numb for weeks. They couldn't make decisions. They were literally, I mean, that's probably an exaggeration, but the psychological impact was huge on their military in the Pentagon. And one assumes that that did carry across the wider government structures and organisations, perhaps as far as the president. The one thing, of course, they did do is they decided that, in light of that attack, they effectively wanted to invoke Article 5 of the NATO agreement, attack on one is attack on all. But as far as they were concerned, certainly for the first decade, even to some extent now, although I think it's waning, it was a war on terror. Terror had come and attacked them. They were now declaring war on terror. And I think so many things that happened after September 2001 have to be seen through the eyes of the American idea that they were conducting a war on terror. And talking to Marines who were serving with me in 2011-12 in Helmand Province, they were there. One of my friends there, she was a grandmother in her mid-50s, and she'd taken a year out of her life effectively to serve in Helmand Province in order to assist this war on terror, to take her part and play her part in that war. And I think maybe that helps to explain why I think the Americans in particular have been absolutely rocked by what's happened in the last 6 weeks, 8 weeks in Kabul and wider Afghanistan.
And isn't one of the major problems in this war against terrorism is that you're fighting an enemy that uses asymmetrical warfare? You're not dealing with conventional nations and the way that nations would conduct warfare. For example, here's the enemy, we'll go invade this country and attack this country, get rid of its leadership, therefore war's over. The fact is that they use asymmetrical warfare, the fact that they use women and children as human shields, the fact that we can't really identify them because they don't wear any proper uniforms as such. They don't convene to the Geneva Convention either in terms of military warfare. Surely that made the task of defeating kind of Islamic extremism and terrorism a far more difficult task than if it was just a confrontation with a nation state.
Yeah, I think it makes it a very complex human terrain for us to operate in. And I don't think we have orientated well to that. We don't face the existential threat of the Russian hordes coming across, the inner-German border, where you need lots of tanks, lots of planes, lots of missiles, etc., etc. The type of warfare, the type of conflict we are engaged in is very different. I'd probably take a step back, perhaps if I may as well, Simon, insofar as, we're fighting an ideology here. We're not fighting a different way of viewing, for geopolitical gains, like the Cold War arguably was, an element of that. Or you could say that, the ideology of communism against capitalism was what we are fighting for. Ultimately, communism as practiced through the USSR, collapsed. But our ideology now as capitalists is perhaps not as strong in terms of fighting against the ideology of Islamists who are taught not just because they can't fight in a conventional way, they're fighting in a much more asymmetric way. But fundamentally, when you are up against an enemy who believes that driving a suicide bomb into the gate outside Kabul airport and killing who knows how many, up to 170 people, is going to buy his instant ticket to paradise with his 72 virgins and all the other things that they're told they're going to achieve. And by the way, that's good for the whole family. So the whole family is going to support suicide bombers. And there's stories in Israel elsewhere of middle-aged mothers who have lots of children who have been suicide bombers because they believe they're doing something for the greater good of their, not just their religion, but their family, and they're buying tickets effectively to paradise for all of their family. That's very difficult to counter, and I would suggest, particularly as Christians, I think we have hope, and ultimately in eternity with the Lord Jesus Christ in heaven. It's a different way of achieving it through the love and the example of Jesus. We should be loving people into the kingdom of God, not strapping explosives to ourselves and blowing up people, thinking that's going to achieve it. And the Christian message and Christian, I suppose, faith is very different to this extremist version of Islam, which is what we're up against and what drives the suicide bombers and the human waves of people who are going to sacrifice their lives to kill a few Westerners, to destroy a few aircraft, to destroy Twin Towers or whatever it is. It's a very different way of looking at things. And I don't think we've really, as Western democracies, fully got our heads around how we counter that yet.
Absolutely. And that's why we need more kind of experts that can influence government when it comes to understanding the kind of Islamic mindset and understanding the culture of these people, and also in the way they conduct warfare as well. I think that's absolutely essential, that you can't go in with a kind of Western mindset into these countries. Now, we know that after 9/11, over 3,000 Americans lost their lives in that horrendous day, almost 20 years ago, when the two towers were destroyed, as well as the Pentagon being destroyed as well. And had it not been for those brave Americans on that other American flight, is it American Airways 91, landing that plane into that field in Pennsylvania, we could have seen that the White House could have been a target, or the Capitol building could have been a target. So it could have been far worse. And this was a fundamental attack on the United States, America's economic prestige, as well as its political and military statures of power in Washington and New York, which led to Operation Enduring Freedom that was launched by George W. Bush in response. Now, the military objectives at the beginning were quite straightforward, weren't they? Just stop al-Qaeda using Afghanistan as a base, and because the Taliban were sheltering bin Laden and al-Qaeda, take out the Taliban and replace them with Northern Alliance. And that was the military objectives. How did it turn from that to staying in Afghanistan for nearly 20 years?
Well, I think first of all, the Taliban were offered, give up Osama bin Laden and Al Qaeda leadership, and we won't come in, and they were determined to not to do that. They felt that would be a selling out effectively on an agreement with bin Laden. So effectively, that left us with no choice but to go in. And it happened again 2 years later in Iraq. Having successfully conquered the country, Geneva Convention places on us, the occupying forces, a whole series of things. We need to look after civil society, provide for them, and do all the other things. And I think we were quite good in the Second World War at doing that. I recently read a book about the attack into Okinawa, which was brutal. But when people did surrender, and particularly the civilians, and they were, that generation, very, very grateful to the Americans, because the Americans brought in food and everything else and provided for the local occupied civilian population. We found ourselves in that situation, and we didn't really have a clear idea, I don't think, not one I've heard, clearly articulated, about how to build a nation state effectively from nothing. And you have to remember, particularly Afghanistan, you know, it still is, and always has been for quite a few years, a very poor, one of the poorest countries in the world. It has effectively one highway that goes around the outside of the country, you know, around the inside of the country, around most of the states, and connects them all up, all the provinces. But in terms of, you know, electricity, toilets, running water, basic infrastructure, roads, there's very little there. You know, it sits on the Silk Route. You know, people have traded through there for many, many years. That's effectively what it has had going for it. Yes, it has some minerals and other things that are attractive to China, America, Russia, whoever's trying to get in there at the moment. But it was a very basic country, and trying to take it from what effectively, probably where we were 500 years ago in the Middle Ages, and bring it into the 21st century was always going to take a lot of focus, money, determination, perhaps blood as well. And I just don't think we really engaged in that properly. We spent far more on our armaments and our missiles than we did on building wells and on all the other things that needed to, and governance, and it needed perhaps a couple of generations of people to be taught how to run a democracy, if that is the model that the local people wanted.
To win hearts and minds. Now, you served in Afghanistan, so can you share with our viewers what Afghanistan is like, what it's like to be a major out there, and also something of the Taliban that you actually faced?
So I have to caveat it that my age and stage in my career, I was very much in the rear. I worked in the headquarters, the US Marine Corps 2MEF headquarters, which is a 2-star headquarters, regional command southwest. So I was in Camp Leatherneck next to Camp Bastion, and there was another Afghan National Army camp called Shorabak, about 35 kilometers external perimeter, roughly the size of Reading. If you can imagine that. That was our secure base. That, you know, if you go back to 2001, there was nothing there. It was just desert. And in a relatively short space of time, the Brits started, and then the Americans and the Afghans came alongside, and we built a whole sort of infrastructure there. So, you know, compared to a lot of my friends and my peers, even the previous regiment who were out on the ground in the patrol bases, I had a very secure, safe, quite relatively comfortable tour. The patrol bases were basic. They were compounds, or perhaps a police station or a district centre, or where it was some sort of a town or village. We wanted to find a secure area that we could patrol out of. The guys were out on patrol all the time. If you weren't on patrol, you were taking your turn at manning the sentry posts and so on. Not much sleep. Often guys out in those patrol bases were lucky if they were getting sort of 4 to 6 hours or more of sleep. At the height of the conflict, from about 2007-8 all the way through to 13-14 when we withdrew, the guys who were patrolling regularly knew that pretty much every time they were going to go out, they were going to get contacted. They would be either shot at, or there would be IEDs, hidden explosive devices in the ground, guys were being sick. Guys were looking for the Padre and saying, "Please pray for us. Please come with us." You know, it was grim. You knew that most tours you were going to take some form of casualties because either deaths or injuries. So, you know, for me, my experience was probably very different to a lot of people out on the ground. The guys on the ground were definitely getting a really, really hard time, and saw and did a lot of things which they're still living with and struggling to live with now.
And also, can you share with us what kind of enemy the Taliban were and why they were so difficult to actually defeat?
Well, they're locals, so they had secure bases in Pakistan, and that's where much of the material and the manpower was coming. They would withdraw there when they had received a good kicking. Interestingly, when you went with the interpreters, so I'm told, they could walk down the street and they go, he's Taliban. So they could see and pick out all the Taliban. Now, rules of engagement, you cannot even arrest or shoot anyone who's not openly a threat to you. So even if they're carrying weapons, you may or may not. There were points where we would clearly engage them if that was the case. But in every engagement, you had to justify why you took the shot. And so in our top left pockets, we would carry, Cod Alpha. And I know some of my Christian friends were praying, Lord, when we're out on patrol today, when I pull the trigger, let it be the right decision. And we've seen since some of the people who perhaps made the wrong decision and have arguably rightly faced justice, because that is the professional British Army way of doing business. That's the way we conduct ourselves. The Taliban don't have any of those constraints. They don't have rules of engagement. They're not worried about civilian casualties. We were very constrained by that, rightly so. You could say it's not a fair fight. Conversely, if I was in their shoes, I'd fight exactly the same way they did, because if you're going up against a professional army, it's very difficult to do that conventionally. In the firefights, where there were heavy firefights, it wasn't often that the Taliban came out on top, because we had more helicopters, more rockets, more weapons, more ammunition than they did, and all the support going all the way back in terms of casualty evacuation and so on. The Taliban didn't have any, very, very limited in terms of all of their supply lines and so on.
The fact that British, American troops and NATO troops have been there coming up for 20 years. We saw that this year that President Biden said that he was going to end the never-ending wars, and this was America's longest war, being almost 20 years, decided to pull US troops out of Afghanistan. Now, essentially, there's nothing, I think, wrong with that. But I think the way that he did it, I think, upset so many people. And this has been described as the worst foreign policy disaster that the US has undertaken since Jimmy Carter was president with the Iranian hostage siege. And it has destroyed America's military reputation across the world. We've seen that they've left over 300 of their Afghan allies behind at the mercy of the Taliban. They strategically calculated that the Afghan army that they spent billions pumping up would be able to stand against the Taliban, in which it just collapsed in a matter of days, not months, as the administration actually thought. So how did Biden and his administration get the US withdrawal so totally wrong?
Well, it's interesting. I mean, it was Trump who announced that we would be withdrawing, or the Americans would be withdrawing. And actually, I read recently that broadly there was agreement, and still is support, that they wanted the Americans out of Afghanistan. I think we just massively misread it. I think the Taliban was surprised, and I think they're quite shrewd. The locals on the ground, I can only imagine, would be looking at, well, where's my long-term interests? And for an Afghan National Army soldier, he's there because he's getting paid. He'll do it as long as it's in his interests, and as long as he feels that there's support behind him. I think certainly on hindsight, we can look back and say it was a very weak government. My job was actually counter-corruption in 2011, 2012. And that was so difficult in terms of trying to actually achieve anything lasting, because it was so endemic, and it came from the very top in Kabul all the way down to the various lowest levels on every roadblock, police or army or wherever you went. So you've got a very weak government. You've got a strong Taliban with ideology and Islamic sort of approach to life. The locals are fed up of being taken to the cleaners or being abused by, the Afghan police or the Afghan army, whoever had the Kalashnikov, and therefore, and I think the Taliban as well. There's some evidence that they were buying off the district and provincial leadership, probably the military leadership. They certainly have made a lot of noises about not pursuing a vendetta against Afghan National Army people. I imagine that there was a caveat, unless of course you fight us, and if you put up a stiff resistance, then we'll make you pay. And so I think there was a growing realization. I mean, there's been stiff fighting around Lashkar, Kandahar, and other places for months, if not years. So we withdrew from Helmand Province in 2014. For 7 years, they've been fighting the Taliban to a greater or lesser extent. So there has been some resistance, but I don't think anyone foresaw. I think it was the messaging. The Americans are leaving, and therefore they've given up on Afghanistan. And because they're not going to push more people and resource and combat power into Afghanistan. They're actually taking it out. And therefore, the Taliban started pushing, and as they started pushing, the dominoes started falling. And as we saw very quickly, I mean, broadly, it was 10 days from really where they started taking provinces to them walking down the high street in Kabul. You look back and you go, wow, we should have seen that coming. But we didn't. Yeah, and nor did the Taliban.
Saigon all over again. 75 with the US withdrawal from
it feels in some ways, I think there's a lot of parallels. You've got a weak, unpopular government in place and a clear message that, do you know what, we've had enough, we're out of here. And, clearly locals, the Taliban clearly saw that as defeat. I think the Americans, it's been a war on terror for 20 years and it started off with a very rapid attack and advance through Afghanistan. I can't remember how many weeks, but the Taliban didn't fight for very many weeks before they effectively evaporated into the local or across the Pakistan border. Arguably 20 years later, we've seen a reversal of that. The Americans are starting to go, oh, they're gone. And the Taliban have done, largely to us, the West, what we did to them, not quite 20 years ago, but almost 20 years ago.
I read the big question, and this is something that I'm personally trying to grapple with myself. Was this pure incompetence on behalf of Biden and his administration, the US withdrawal from Afghanistan, those horrendous scenes that we saw in the month of August with Afghans trying to get on board those American transport planes to flee Afghanistan, flee the Taliban? Or was this a kind of more sinister maneuver on behalf of Biden administration? I say that because they provided lists of all the American personnel that were in Afghanistan. They left behind lists of those Afghans who cooperated with the American and NATO forces. They've left so many allies behind to face the wrath of the Taliban. They've left their military equipment behind as well. And they also paid the Taliban huge amounts of money. And it looks like that this was a planned chaotic withdrawal. And of course, the consequences of this withdrawal now for American military strength is frightening. Together putting a doubt in the minds of America's allies in the Middle East, as well as actually undermining NATO. So the strategic ramifications of this US withdrawal from Afghanistan are truly absolutely catastrophic.
Yeah, I think there's an element of truth in that. I mean, I couldn't. It's difficult for me to comment about the policy and Biden policy and what happens, even behind closed doors. Certainly in Washington. I think the sheer scale. I mean, I do think. I was in touch with a number of our members who deployed to Kabul. I was mentioning before the program about my friend who was flying, the ambassador out on the last aircraft out. I think within the circumstances that we found ourselves deploying, the British military and the American military did a good job. Stand fast. The horrendous scenes of people falling off aircraft and so on, that was in the very first few days before we'd really cleared and secured the actual airport itself. And I think the Taliban, at that point they were still sort of either on the edges or coming into Kabul, and I think everyone just thought they were just going to massacre everybody. Certainly those who were desperate and hanging onto the aircraft. I think once we had secured the airport itself, then it was more organised and measured in terms of getting people out. I think the short nature notice of it is clear. I mean, I think the British Embassy, people were finding stuff flying around, and we suddenly were trying to get hold of people that we'd compromised in effect. In a very chaotic, short notice sort of near operation, national evacuation operation like that, it's very difficult. I wouldn't say, it was not a permissive environment for us to operate that. We did the same, I think the last one we did, I could be mistaken, was 2006 out of Beirut when the Israelis went across the border to recover their soldiers who Hezbollah had captured. That was relatively simple because we had a port as well as an airport. We had Cyprus very close by, and there wasn't fighting in Beirut around the actual airport and around the port. Kabul was very different, landlocked country, and the only bit of turf that we had any influence on was Kabul airport itself at the end. So I think militarily, we will have learnt lessons. We probably did as good a job as we could have, and the guys were absolutely chin-strapped. I mean, they didn't want to sleep because they knew if they were sleeping, then they weren't processing people and helping people to get on the planes and get out. And so, for many nights, they were lucky if they got an hour or two. And if you look at the photos, they are exhausted. Getting on those planes at the end and getting off. And that's just the physical impact. That's not the psychological impact of standing at the gate watching, children, women and children being crushed to death because people are so frightened and so desperate to get over. We saw some of the images of children being handed over the fence, both to British and American troops. I know a couple of the chaplains, and they were praying, and they did see some of the families reunited because there was this rush to, isolated children being separated from their parents, and trying to get them back together and put them on the plane to go to wherever together, wherever that plane was going. Yeah, I mean, would we have done things differently? Of course we would have. Hindsight's a wonderful thing. Certainly militarily, I imagine if you spoke to President Biden, he would reflect that he might have done things differently. We don't have that. We don't have that luxury, time machines and other things. But yeah, on the face of it, a real mess.
I suppose the big question really is to ask that this was a military operation to withdraw US forces out of Afghanistan. And yet Biden put the State Department in control. Now, surely that is an absolute disastrous move because it's the Department of Defense that would plan the whole military operation, including the logistics and everything else. But then to put the State Department with different objectives from what the military would have led to even more greater confusion and a lack of clarity and understanding in carrying out orders.
Yeah, I mean, command and control is always key, and it's one of the things that's discussed the most and can be hugely political. And I don't know the American system well enough, or even the exact nature of how they conducted their operations. I do know for us, the kind of the critical path, the critical activity of getting people out fell with the civil servants from the Foreign Commonwealth Development Office, the FCDO, headed up by the ambassador, who ostensibly took the last plane out.
And I think we have to say he did a fantastic job.
Yeah, and I think showed courageous leadership by remaining in place. So I know that the FCDO put more people in to try and process, and the soldiers and chaplains and others were involved in trying to established. I mean, basically, so I'm aware of a translator. He translated for a friend of mine who was the defence attaché out there a few years ago. And this translator wanted to fly out with his wife, with their little baby, 1-year-old son, and with his sister. And they tried getting to the airport a couple of times before they were successfully got to the Baron Hotel and into the British sort of sphere of influence, where they were then put on a plane and they're now safely in the UK. There's a family that comes to you. Now, in this case, there was communication and they knew the family, and there was a personal contact. But you've got a guy who says, look, I'm a former British Forces translator. Here's my paperwork. This is my wife, this is my sister, this is my son, or sons or daughters or whatever. And the guys on the ground, the men and women from the FCDO, were trying to establish, okay, well, we can see you're a genuine article. You are entitled to be flown out and back to UK. Can we establish, where's your paperwork for your wife? And is this really your sister, or did you just meet this lady outside and she slipped you a couple of $100 to say that this is your sister and these are all your children? Actually, they could be from any family who are desperate enough to say, just take my children, please just take my children. And that was the bit that was taking the time. The military piece is to provide the security for that to happen. And so that is the bit that needed to happen in the airport. And that took a little bit of time to put into place. But once that was in place, and things started flowing. I mean, I know one of the days, nearly 100 aircraft were coming and going. Whether or not those seats were filled, they had to take their slot. They had to take off on time because the next aircraft was coming in. So they're undoubtedly, and I know early on, I think, I can't remember which nation, German or one of the nations flew, and they only had 6 people, or it was largely an empty aircraft. There's an element that you've got to keep the aircraft, a bit like the Berlin airport. Berlin airlift. You've got to keep the aircraft moving because you've only got a finite amount of space in the airport, and you've got to move those aircraft out.
Rhett, we've got about 8 minutes left of the programme, or probably a bit less than that, and I need to ask you 3 very important questions before we conclude this programme. I suppose the first question is, considering, according to my notes here, that 457 brave and courageous British military soldiers died in Afghanistan over the past 20 years. And many questions being asked, was it actually worth it to send our troops into Afghanistan? And clearly it was, because it prevented Afghanistan being used by the Taliban to launch terror attacks against the West. That was the main military objective of Operation Enduring Freedom. But also the other fact is the humanitarian work, the winning the hearts and souls, building the worlds, building up communities, giving women education that they didn't have before. And now Afghanistan, 20 years on, is a completely different place and a different society and culture than it was when the Taliban were last in power.
Yeah, I think it's very hard. I haven't got a close family friend or a mate who was killed. I know one of the sappers in my regiment was killed on Operation Herrick 15 when I was out there. So I'm not invested emotionally in that sort of kind of close way. Yes, we lost a lot of soldiers. In fact, of us. Not of more concern, but the same level of concern is the impact, psychological impact, because that was 457 soldiers, but actually there are many more who served out there, lost limbs, had PTSD, have combat trauma, are trying to process, particularly in light of what's happened. And I found it distressing. I had a phone call from one of our members who served in the Air Force, left in 2003. So he never served in Afghanistan. But he said to me, I just have to talk to somebody who understands what is going on. And this was in the early days of the evacuation itself. I think we have a choice. We can either choose to look at all the negatives and say, that was not worth it, and in blood and treasure. Or we can say, there's a generation of Afghans who have had some level of opportunity that they wouldn't have, particularly young women and girls, that they've enjoyed and had for the last couple of decades, which they would not have had the Taliban still remained in power. Who knows what's going to happen? The Taliban are making noises at the sort of spokesman leadership level. What happens on the ground remains to be seen.
And the other question, I think, is, has the world become a more dangerous place now? Will Afghanistan be used as an operation for Islamists, whether they're ISIS, Hezbollah, Hamas, ISIS-K, to actually launch terror attacks against the West? And because of America's military deterrent seems to be eroded, it seems that China and the Russians will now take advantage of this. Our European allies are also questioning America's commitment to NATO. Israel's worried about sharing intelligence with their closest friend and ally, the United States, and also worried about their position in the Middle East. And so this can only empower the extremists and probably extended the war on terror by essentially an extra decade now, because of the actions of Biden. So do you think the world is now a more dangerous place, not because of the US withdrawal, but the way that the US withdrew?
I think in terms of credibility, I think they didn't come out of it well. I think that's of concern. For right or wrong, commentators have said that the Americans are the world policemen. And if they're deciding that actually they don't want to be the world policeman anymore, they just want to focus on America, and are tending back to that sort of isolationist position, I think that leaves, where there's a vacuum, people will fill it. And whether that's Islamists, whether it's a Russian interest, Chinese interests, or there's a myriad of different players and operators and ideologies out there that could fill that space. I think time will tell. I mean, it doesn't feel like there is a lot of hope. It feels like, particularly looking at what's happened in Kabul, and of course, there's the wider Afghanistan and the border posts and all of that we haven't really heard very much about at all. But it does seem to feel a darker place and a less optimistic, less hopeful place.
And a lot of media reports indicating that now the Taliban are better equipped than most NATO members, which is frightening, with the American military hardware that was left behind. And I think maybe that's for another discussion. But in the last few minutes of the programme, how can our Christian viewers watching this programme, whose hearts have been touched by this programme and what's happened in Afghanistan, really stand with our serving men and women who have decided that they want to protect our nation, and they are Christians in the armed forces? How can we stand with them, pray for them and support them through the excellent ministry that you do through the Armed Forces Christian Union?
Well, I think the key thing is pray. Ultimately God is still sitting on his throne. The Lord Jesus is sovereign. We need to petition him to stand in the gap, to cry out to him, to repent of our sins as a nation. We bear that as members of the armed forces as well. Be informed. Get informed. Go onto the website. We have pray for the number 4 our forces. A specific link on there. We put links to the operations, the Navy, Army, and Air Force. If you're really interested, look out for events. Come and join us. We pray midday. For half an hour every day, Monday to Friday, on Zoom. You're very welcome to come and be part of that and get informed as to how to pray specifically, not just for our leaders, but especially for the Christians who are serving in the Army, Navy and Air Force. And
we very much appreciate the work that they do, very much appreciate the work that you do, Rhett, and leading and guiding Christians, particularly young Christians in our armed forces, who are really putting themselves on the front line in order to protect us. And sadly, as we've unpacked the US withdrawal from Afghanistan, see that the world has become a more dangerous and less stable place, and so therefore we can see more pockets of conflict emerge around the world. And of course our Christian soldiers and our airmen and our Navy will be deployed to those future conflict zones. So, being in the military, it's always being prepared for the next conflict. But I just want to thank you for being my guest on the Middle East Report. Always a pleasure to have you on the programme, and thank you for what you do, Rhett.
Thank you, Simon.
And I want to thank you for watching today's program. I think Rhett really did clearly explain the situation facing our armed forces in Afghanistan. We need to pray for our Christian brothers and sisters who are stuck in Afghanistan to get out, but also pray that despite the fact we're seeing the collapse of American power in the world, we could be thankful that God is on the throne and he's sovereign and he's in control. So thank you for watching today's Middle East Report.